the keynote that I'm giving does run into some themes from what you saw in yesterday's keynote addresses in the morning and the afternoon. But you'll see some unique perspectives as well. One of the great things about academia is that there's plenty of room for dialogue, some debate, and of course differing perspectives on similar or even the same issues. So you'll see some of that today in terms of some different ways of thinking about similar topics. But there will be some history, some of a focus on what's happening now in our field, and then some future perspectives as well. A lot of what I'm focusing on today has to do with identity, and there's lots of definitions of identity. It really has to do with how you see yourself, but also how other people see you, right? And we'll think about this today as a profession. What does identity mean for us as a group of physical educators? And not just in terms of K through 12 or P through 12 physical education, but also for higher education. When we talk about preparing people for a career in teaching or for a career in teacher education / research if they go into the academy. But just a little bit about my identity. You heard already that I'm a third culture kid, and I grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, Singapore. I was at Singapore American School, International School of Cyprus, I'm not sure if it's called that anymore, in Nicosia, and then graduated from Taipei American School. So I spent a long portion of my childhood in Southeast Asia, been to HKIS a number of times as an athlete when I was in school. So I really feel probably more at home here in this context than I ever will being back in the United States because of that upbringing. And anyone here that experienced something like that as a kid or who has children now who's growing up in a context like this, that's the reality. You feel the most at home when you're traveling. And there's some disadvantages to that, I guess, but I would never give up my wonderful childhood for anything. I also spent a little bit of time in the States before going overseas. A lot of my time has been in the East Coast of the United States. So this is me a little while ago, promising youth and a little deceptive in terms of what would happen in terms of a full head of hair, but this is probably still how my parents see me. I said identity is how you see yourself and how other people see you, right? And as a parent, I have a 6th grader at home, my son. I can't, every time I look at him, of course, I still see the infant that he once was. And I'm sure that whenever I'm with my parents that they still see this image of me, at least occasionally. And these are just some photographs from when we were in Karachi. That's me and my twin brother, Kyle. Kyle and I are fraternal twins. And here we are, some more pictures from Karachi, me looking very serious, there with one of our good friends. And I think when I was in Taiwan, what I'm probably still recognized as is what I did as an athlete. That's how people still remember me. I've gone back to TAS in recent years, and when I talk to people, they still talk about IASIS. They don't remember me for what I was as a student or as an individual in any other way, but they see me as the person who was a distance runner. This was IASIS last year, or I guess in the spring. Looks like I still have the record for the 1,500 meters. I've got the 5,000 too, by the way, but they retired that event, probably due to me about killing myself in 1993 when I was over at International School of Bangkok, and I had to go to the hospital, and they decided probably that event wasn't the best for high school age youth in 110-degree weather. So, as you also heard that I taught overseas, this was way back in 2001 to 2003, and I was at Dubai American Academy, but was only 5 years old at the time. And that's me, and this is just some pictures of the places that I taught overseas. I spent about a half a year also in the Carol Morgan School in the Dominican Republic before actually starting my master's. That's really the point at which I realized I needed to be in physical education for the rest of my life. Some pictures from Dubai. Not my real hair, by the way. Okay. So just a little bit about who I am, and of course you know now that I'm a learned professor, and this is another portion of my identity. You may not recognize me from that, but that is me, by the way. I've seen some pretty good beards around here, by the way. I can't see where you are right now, but there's some pretty good beards. There's one right there. Yeah. Okay, so if we ask the same questions about ourselves in physical education, who are we? Who do we want to be? How do other people see us? There's actually a pretty extensive literature on this. And you've heard some themes about it already in different veins, but what we really know is that most of the time in physical education, because we're a relatively small number of teachers compared to the vast number of people in the school, many of whom work in the classroom, we sometimes work in and feel a little bit isolated in our jobs. And you heard a little bit about themes on marginalization yesterday as well. What is marginalization and what contributes to it? There's a lot of factors. In fact, this research has been going on for decades now. Consistently, we find that we find ourselves in the periphery as physical education teachers. When we don't, it's for a number of reasons that usually have to do with our own willingness to take a step up, become a champion for what we do, and really connect with others in a school community. It's not always easy to do. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, we meet with certain barriers in doing that. But these are kind of the usual suspects. When we talk about marginalization, people ask, why do we feel marginalized? Why do people see us in certain ways? Often we're not viewed as an academic subject, right? We don't really always have consistency in terms of what we think our academic goals should be in physical education. What are our programs setting out to do? The standards that we set out for ourselves as professionals, many people argue are unachievable. And if we were to focus just on one of the 5 or 6 things that we think are really important for physical educators to be able to do, we might have a better chance. But even then, with our allocated curriculum time, we'd probably be moving up a pretty steep hill. And so that has contributed to some of the marginalized status of our field and our profession. Limited accountability and assessment practices. In South Carolina, for instance, people pretty much can do what they want in physical education. The rate at which a building administrator comes in to observe a PE teacher is 0 to maybe once every 4 or 5 years. That's very infrequent, which is very different from the kind of exposure and accountability that people in the States who are working in PE are getting in their coaching realm, because we have interscholastic sports in schools. So that's a whole different issue, but it does contribute to the marginalization problem for us. The low impact of physical education, teacher education. Pre-service education, we have a very limited evidence to say that anything we do in the 4-year programs that we generally have across the country in the US is doing anything to actually prepare people for a new culture of schooling. And that what actually happens is when people get into a school, they've just gone through a teacher preparation program, they're raring to go, they're excited, and then the dominant culture at their school basically takes hold. And oftentimes, the dominant culture isn't what we've been teaching people to subscribe to within a teacher education program in a university or college. And so that's there. And then the unflattering portrayal by the popular media. And we can all think of movies and situations that we've seen where the physical education teacher, the gym teacher, the person who's most likely to screw up in the school building is portrayed that way, right? And sometimes, unfortunately, those stereotypes are actually happening in real life. And we see these kinds of things in popular media. We see them disseminated widely. And in the United States, the roll out the ball technique, the sports camp as physical education programming, or the fitness testing as physical education programming tends to still rule the day for many programs across the country. But what people often don't think about is this contributing factor. And I'm going to put myself in as being one of the culprits here, is the fact that we have paradigm shifts in our field. What is a paradigm and what is a paradigm shift? This is not my language, this came from Kuhn in the 1960s, but a paradigm is really a model, a way of doing things. What we focus on and the implications that has for our professional practice and the things that we really think about as being important or priorities. And a paradigm shift then is that when we really start to move our focus to something else and the implications that then has for what we do and what we value, right? And it so happens in physical education that we frequently experience paradigm shifts. You heard a little bit about this in the presentations yesterday as well, in terms of our allegiance to what we really feel we should be doing as professionals. This is just a recent example over the last 100 years or so, but we can see in the early 20th century, we really, in the United States, were focused mostly on gymnastics and physical training. That moved in the Depression era to a focus on social and recreational goals, just due to context and the resources that were available in schools at that time. And then during World War II, all the way through the Cold War in the United States, physical fitness ruled the day for obvious reasons. We've wanted to use physical education programs as a way to train people to be able to serve in the military, essentially. And then most recently, we've had this obesity epidemic, which is now curtailed into something that has now widely recognized as what's called a pandemic, worldwide obesity pandemic. And there's lots of ways of looking at that. And of course, we can move into a perspective that says, we don't need to worry about obesity necessarily, or that the statistics tell us one side of the story, but not a different side of the story. But we do know that there's a lot of attention right now to obesity. And it's something that increasingly across the world, people are wondering, is this something that we can actually deal with? Can we change human behavior? Does this have more to do with the built environment? What are the complex issues? How do we really deal with this? And is it part of the role of physical education to even think about that? So we'll talk about that a little bit here in just a minute. But obviously, when we think about that context, it shifted our paradigm again to really thinking about promoting physical activity, because physical activity is a known correlate of obesity and other health-related issues that we've been looking at over the last 30 or so years now. And we also know around the beginning of the 1980s, there was a critical publication in the US called A Nation at Risk, and that started what we call the Standards and Accountability Movement. And at that time, we started to really ask ourselves as well, are we doing everything in physical education we can to measure what we're capable of and how well we're performing as a profession? So here we get, this is the physical activity paradigm, the most recent one you saw on the previous slide, right? And this was a publication in 1991 that was seen as a seminal work. It started the conversation legitimately around what is the role of physical education in public health. Do we have a place that we can be there and be a legitimate player in that field? Should we be aligned in our work with what public health professionals think physical education can do in the name of public health? And it took a while, but we started to develop some models based on some earlier ideas really coming out of the 1980s. And we came up with this position statement in the United States from what was then the National Association for Sport and Physical Education. And it was a position statement that talks about what we're calling a comprehensive school physical activity program. It's the idea that it takes a village. It's not just a responsibility for a PE teacher to get kids moving every day or to promote long-term lifespan physical activity. This is something that requires a whole group of professionals, including parents and community members as well, right? And there'll be just after this keynote today, I'm doing a presentation all about comprehensive school physical activity more specifically. And just this year, my friend Russ Carson and I published this book, which is the first kind of comprehensive resource about all of the research and the implications for practice around comprehensive school physical activity. But you can look at the time frame here, 1991 to 2019, and keep that in mind as we move to some of the next few slides here. Keep that in mind, because what we're really seeing here is the progression of an idea that started to take hold and that still is received with a lot of debate and discussion. But there is certainly a critical mass of people who really buy into this idea of the alignment between physical activity and physical education, okay? And it's now just to the point where we have a comprehensive resource of the emerging evidence around what is the role of physical education in public health and what can we actually accomplish in that realm. All right, so that's the time frame we're looking at. It is still a very young field of research after a good 30 years, and we're very limited impact at this point on professional practice. The research that we do have suggests that all that we've written about comprehensive school physical activity, everything we've tried to do to promote through schools more active kids, more active youth, more active staff, more active families, hasn't really changed what we do in our physical education practice. It hasn't changed what we do in our overall school practice. And we also have seen very limited change in youth physical activity. And by the way, you've already this was mentioned yesterday, and everybody's probably already aware of it. We have already an emerging paradigm now that is shifting the focus away from physical activity to what? Mental health and social emotional learning, right? Which are also public health issues. So this is just a few examples. In the United States right now, we earned a D- for overall physical activity for youth. Most kids aren't meeting the physical activity benchmarks that we've set out for them. For school-age youth, that just means 1 hour a day. So out of a 24-hour day, 60 minutes should be spent doing mostly moderate to vigorous aerobic activity, and very few US kids are meeting that benchmark. Despite the last 30 years of pretty intense focus on different methods, different strategies, and ways to try to get kids more active, particularly through school, since we have access to virtually all kids in the school environment. It happens to be, by the way, the biggest natural intervention that we have in the world to get kids to do certain things, because all kids attend school. But we're not getting there. We have not moved the needle, all right? And the school environment itself, as a promotion device for physical activity, also gets a D-, by the way. Like I said, there are correlations that are significant, that need to be recognized, regardless of your perspective on the issue. This is the trend that we have documented over time. And so since 1995 until 2020, we see a precipitous incline in the rate of obesity for children and adolescents in the United States. That's not just a US phenomenon. Here's a map of the world. And we can see that obesity has taken hold, not just in the US, but in a number of other places worldwide. And that trend is increasing. That trend is increasing. Okay? The deep red that you see there, by the way, that's over 30%, at or over 30% of the population of a particular country who are classified as obese. Okay, so just a quick idea about some implications, right? We talked about paradigm shifts. The paradigm is the model, we shift the model and we focus on something else, but what's the implication? Well, one thing that happens in research is that when we focus on something else, the outcome of interest changes, right? So if our intention is to try to help people increase their motor skills and develop motor competence, which most standards that I've ever seen in physical education, somewhere in the standards that are written, or in a national course of study or a national curriculum, motor competence is something that people value in physical education. And when we look at that as the outcome, then what does that mean? We think about, theoretically, what does it take to produce that outcome? Schema theory is one example of a theory that deals with motor skill learning, okay? And we apply many of those principles in our day-to-day practice. You may not know that you do always, but they exist, they're there. Funding streams usually have to do with educational funders, like the Department of Education. And we start thinking about a professional preparation that focuses on teacher effectiveness. What does it mean to be an effective teacher when you're looking at how do you produce motor skillfulness? And there's a certain skill set as a teacher to be able to do that. Probably everybody in here has skills that you can identify right off the top of your head that you know help people get better with their motor skills. As a teacher, there are pedagogical skills that help you do that. And then, of course, the standards and accountability will be framed around that particular outcome, okay? But if we change the paradigm and we say that what we're really after is physical activity promotion, then motor skills may take a back seat. They don't have to disappear. And in fact, what we have seen in research is that the two are very closely related. When we teach for motor skills, we are actually promoting physical activity, and which is going to feed into kind of the last part of my presentation here today. But understand that the theoretical perspective changes. Now we're looking at human behavior change, and we're looking at models like social ecological models, the influence of the environment on someone's physical activity behavior, the influence of the teacher, the influence of policy. All of that becomes relevant now because it's a complex issue. How do you get someone to move more? The funding streams come out of public health instead of education. The National Institutes of Health is the example here for the United States. The preparation of what does it mean to be an effective teacher moves a little bit from how do you teach motor skills to now how do you work with a school society, a school community, to really build all of these supplemental physical activity opportunities beyond what you do just in PE. How do you make that village operate? That's a different skill set than teaching people how to dribble. It's a very different skill set, and most PE teachers have not developed that skill set, at least through formal professional preparation mechanisms. And then, of course, what we're accountable for is, did our students move? Yeah, they might have gotten some learning and motor skills, but did they move? Did they meet the benchmark? Were they physically active an hour a day? Did you contribute to that as a physical educator? Did your program help? So it makes a difference in what we're focusing on when we have these paradigm shifts every so often. And this is really interesting to me, and I didn't know this actually before preparing for this presentation, but I was wondering, well, if we are always having these paradigm shifts, how long does it really take, if we're going to focus on physical activity promotion, we're going to build a research evidence base, we're going to support what people do in their professional practice. We're going to be able to say we have the evidence to help you be effective in your job to meet the intended outcome. It usually takes, on average, about 17 years in the health field for research to make its way into practice. Now remember the timeline that I told you just a little bit back, a few slides ago. About a 30-year period from the idea to the point where we started to develop an emerging research base around that idea. When we start thinking about how long it really takes for translation to happen, we know that we're going to probably always be on a slippery surface if the paradigm shifts continue to happen at the same frequency. As long as we're having paradigm shifts, we're not likely to ever be operating in terms of what is best practice. And when we talk about best practice, what we usually mean is, what does the research say? And what is the implication then for what you do as a professional? But we are always kind of sliding around on that surface because the surface is unstable. The surface is the paradigm that has moved back and forth and to different directions, really for as long as we can think back in physical education historically. Something that contributes to that as well is this idea that you know that with research, it's more than just saying you did a study. Every study that happens has to go through a number of stages. You have to first, with physical activity, for instance, what is that? Well, now that it's important to us, we're going to focus on it. How do you measure it? We have to define it. We have to learn how to measure it. It's not the same measurement for someone who's maybe this age versus that age. How do we validate those measures? And then how do we implement those measures into proof of concept studies, feasibility? We're going to pilot test certain ideas. We're going to actually see if these ideas work at large scale, like a full state in the United States, or at a national level. And then we have to look for follow-up and sustainability. Well, it's great we implemented a new program. That was really well done, and we saw great outcomes. We got kids more active, but then the program folded because the principal left the school. Oops. So what about sustainability? How do we deal with that? That also requires a research evidence base. And then, of course, pulling all the research together into these systematic reviews, which considers all the studies that have been done, how effective overall have they really been. And I said already, so far with physical activity promotion through schools, they've been negligible, minimally effective, minimally, despite very, very lofty funding kinds of initiatives that have happened over a period of decades. And something else to consider is this. You know, if we talk about physical activity promotion as an innovation for us in physical education, okay, we're not used to doing that. We may not have all the skills required to make a whole school community become on board with what we're trying to do. If we see that as an innovation, how long does it take to adopt that innovation? This is a whole different literature base. This comes out of a field that looks at diffusions and adoption. And normally, for someone to become an adopter, only a very small minority of a particular organization or community will be an early adopter. Okay, you're going to see that some people are innovators and they like to adopt things very early, but there's this chasm, which is where you're going to hit kind of that point in an organization like a school, and you're going to say, well, it seems like some people are really interested in this idea of being on board with trying to get people active. There's classroom teachers who want to do it. We've got some parents who are on board, but really most people are still at this decision-making point. And they're considering things like, well, is this advantageous compared to what we're doing now, and how so? And is it really simple to do, or is it really hard to do? Am I going to have to learn new skills? Is it compatible with what I already know how to do? Is it philosophically compatible with what I already believe and that I value? How observable are the results? And also, am I going to get to experiment with it, or do I have to adopt everything in full right away? People consider all of those things as they move into this decision-making point, and a lot of people say, no, I don't want to adopt. And so there's this perspective that we have to consider, particularly in educational organizations, particularly because, and I forgot to mention, we are preventive in what we're trying to do versus incremental. So in agriculture, I might have an innovation in farming, and it's going to show me very quickly the outcome that could be desirable. I know within a season whether or not this innovation is working the way that I want. That's very different from education. Most of us don't know the outcomes of our work until potentially years later, particularly when we attach our work to long-term outcomes like lifespan physical activity, which in the United States is considered the purpose of physical education programs nationally. But how do you measure that? That's not something that we would consider a short-term goal. And so as a result, people have a much harder time thinking about these perceived attributes, particularly the advantages of what you're doing, and it takes them a lot longer to really get to a point where they want to adopt something because they don't know if it's going to be effective. So we have an identity crisis, Students' outcomes are constantly shifting, right? And we have not built a solid research foundation to develop best practices under any of the paradigms that we've shifted through at this point. Science has had very little influence on public school programs or education policy for that matter. We lack, as a profession, a sustainable purpose. Even amongst ourselves, the term physical education means many, many different things. Think about what that is for the public, right? The rest of society, PE, gym. What does that mean? To a lot of people, it means probably the opposite of what we'd like it to mean. And many of us are going to probably find different kind of allegiances within our own profession of what we really want to subscribe to. And there's limited evidence that we are meeting any of the standards at this point. So if we were to hold still just for a little while longer, all right, resist that next shift, or find a way to make that next shift encompass where we've just come from so that we don't have to abandon, essentially, all of the work that we've been doing to try to build the evidence for what works within our particular paradigm. This most recent one being centered around the obesity pandemic, but really more on the behavioral aspects. How do we get people to move more? And not just now. How do we get people to move more when they leave the supportive infrastructure of a school environment and they move into their young adult life and beyond? What does that take? What mechanisms need to be in place there? Because that's not the same, is it? We haven't figured those things out yet, and we won't if we abandon all the work that we've done up to this point. But we can make a difference if we start to think about some of these things here. So we could positively impact perceptions about the academic status, right? This has to do with the marginalization slide that you saw earlier. Identify achievable program goals versus philosophically trying to stand on a ground that we may never be able to realistically accomplish. Increase stakeholders' interest and accountability, promote formal assessment, guide teacher education and doctoral training, and of course build consensus around professional identity and advocacy. So how do we get there? How do we get to a point where we start to really build that consensus and make that difference? Well, the first thing is, I feel that we have a lot going for us right now. Yes, we haven't gotten to where we want to be, but we are building the momentum to actually get somewhere after 30 years of trying to figure out physical activity promotion. We do have an emerging evidence base. And we probably have a more robust and solid evidence base related to promoting physical activity than we have in most of the other things that we try to do related to our goals in physical education at this point. All right, so we have something going for us there, and I can tell you that our partnerships with public health do not always work in our favor, and a lot of the time, the onus is on us for that not working out. And I'll describe that a little bit here in just a second. But understand that I believe we can make a difference, probably the biggest difference in terms of a societal level impact through what we do when we partner effectively with public health in a way that is mutually beneficial to society and the aims of public health, but also to us as physical educators who work in education. We also need to develop research agendas and frameworks that encompass multiple health outcomes, and you'll see a diagram of what I mean in just a minute. Demonstrate relationships between physical education learning and indices of public health. We want people not just to be able to say that physical activity promotes academic achievement. We want people to be able to say that physical education promotes all school outcomes and is integral to the development of a human being, and that it is important to someone's long-term healthy life. We need to disentangle physical activity from physical education for many policymakers and people even just in the education system who often confuse those two things. And sometimes what we do in our research is that we focus on physical activity accrual of minutes. How many minutes were people, did they get to 60 minutes? But we don't show how those minutes did anything for our learning outcomes in physical education. That's problematic Because you heard yesterday, we are under threat as programs in schools if people see physical education strictly as physical activity. It does not take a lot to get someone moving in a 30-minute class period. What it does take a lot of is the skills, the pedagogy, the training required to really be a physical educator and get people to that next long-term outcome of lifespan physical activity. That's a different matter. And we also need to conduct research examining the value of supplemental physical activity on physical education learning, promote evidence-based practices, as opposed to, it's great to stand on philosophical ground, but the better that we can be on actually relying on a strong evidence base as practitioners, the more we'll know that we can be effective at actually meeting the intended outcomes. And of course, building political advocacy into university accountability structures. That's my arena. Because right now, as a university person, to be promoted and tenured and to be successful in that environment, working with policymakers really doesn't fit into that equation in most situations. What's important is that you publish and get grant money. What's important is that you teach effectively. What's important is that you contribute in a service kind of way to your university, to your community, to your profession. But working with policymakers, that is another skill set in and of itself, and one that can take people a very long distance in terms of making a real difference moving that needle. And I do not see them as dichotomous things. A good educator knows policy and can wield some tools to make a difference in that arena. I've seen it done in South Carolina. The greatest example we had for PE was we had the first statewide physical education assessment system in the United States a few years ago. That meant that every 3 years, each physical education program in the state of South Carolina had to submit evidence that students in those programs were meeting 4 performance indicators. It was the only time in the country that anyone had ever done this. And what happened? Some teachers didn't like it. It was the first time they were actually being looked at closely. They quit. The people who were really effective teachers, who were doing a great job, they were welcoming the new system. And they actually collected really useful data. We did some studies on it. It made a huge difference in teaching practice. It made a difference in student outcomes. The policy arena allowed for us to really have a handle on what was happening in the schools. But getting to policy and making those changes took a whole different kind of skill set, and it took people about a decade from the Department of Physical Education at WSCC to get to the point where they understood the dynamics of the policy arena at the state level and to make that impact. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but after this presentation, I'll be focusing more on this in my short lecture. Just understand that when we focus on promoting physical activity using this school-wide approach, this was the Comprehensive School Physical Activity Program, and when we want to focus on social-emotional learning, we're looking at a lot of the same kinds of mechanisms or variables to do a good job. We're looking at the community. We're looking at the home environment, family and community, right? We're looking at the school environment during school. We're looking at the classroom space, which has a lot to do with staff involvement. And of course, we're looking at outcomes that we see are shared in each of these models, each of these approaches. So, like I said before, physical activity promotion, social emotional learning, mental health, they are public health issues that happen to have certain areas of alignment that some people have missed. What I'm not advocating for is to say we don't need to focus on mental health. Obviously, I think physical education can play a very significant role there because it is tied to public health agendas. But I also see that it's consistent with what we've already been focusing on in many ways, because the same professionals, both in education and in public health, still are relevant and need to be at the table to make a difference. All right? And this here is just an example of something that we've come up with recently to more clearly illustrate that all of the different people who work in the school, the staff, the people outside the school, the family and the community, okay, the programs that we have before and after school for kids, recess, drop-in activity kinds of events for kids during their lunchtime, and classroom-based physical activity experiences, all can support what we do in physical education. We know that people get an education through their physical activity, but the physical activity that we promote should also lead with a good quality PE program to this longer-term lifetime physical activity outcome. And I'll just show you this also really quickly, but this is the idea that if we're going to make a change and really integrate what we do with public health, that's going to have implications for what we do with our alignment of our standards with public health agendas, because right now the standards for physical education do not reflect a public health emphasis. That's at all levels, including doctoral education. Focusing on evidence-based curriculum versus philosophy-based curriculum. And then, of course, partnering with public health organizations, gearing professional development toward public health alignment, and supporting advocacy. Advocacy counts. But we don't teach teacher candidates to be advocates for what they do. We don't teach them how to politic, and most people are afraid of actually working in a political arena because of that. So what is your role? What is your role? Critically examine your chosen activities. All right? Think about what you're doing now as a teacher. And ask yourself this question. Does what I do contribute to promoting physical activity? And if it does, how? And based on what evidence? Have you measured it? Is it eyeballing, or is it really documenting whether or not what you're doing is making a difference in the physically active lives of your kids? And that doesn't mean necessarily just physical activity minutes that they're getting each day. It means if they're getting to be more motor skilled, for instance, or if you're giving them a basis in physical fitness knowledge, how is that changing their behavior outside of class? Are they more motivated to be physically active? Do they find it to be something that is of value to them? That's the kind of data that can really count in a movement like this. Reach out to public health professionals in your area. Know that they care about kids the same way that you do, but they bring different perspectives and that they bring different skills, and that working with them can optimize and lever what you are really trying to accomplish. Conduct action research and partner with universities to help with research questions. If you're near any institutes of higher education, there are people who, by nature of their professional work, are going to be doing research. Therefore, if you're interested in getting data on how well you're doing, they can help with that. And many of them would probably be thrilled to know that there's a school environment nearby that can help them accomplish what they're trying to do, which is to build the literature around what we're trying to accomplish. Systematically document your program and assess student outcomes. Use data to advocate for what you do. Make other people aware of all the great things that you're accomplishing in your program. Don't keep it to yourself, particularly your building administrators. Extend physical education into classrooms, recess, before and after school programs, and at home. Know that there's more than just the PE lesson that can support what you're trying to accomplish. If you build it, that you're going to have to think about what does that mean in your context and what would it take. We won't talk about the WSCC model because we're out of time, but I want to let you know that there are other resources like this out there that you can start to position your work in ways that matter from a public health standpoint. And in closing, the most significant impact PE can have is at the level of public health. I firmly believe that. Out of everything that we've ever subscribed to in our field, making a difference at the society level and in people's long-term health, to me, is a real contribution that we can make. And I think that we are beginning to get some evidence that that's possible, but we just need to figure out some strategies that can really take hold. Our commitment to a long-term vision for the profession is critical. We're just beginning to amass the research needed to move the needle on the outcomes of interest within this particular paradigm. But we have to make a commitment. We can't just keep moving from one paradigm to the next or from one focus to the next. It matters that we actually stay still for a little while longer. We don't have to choose between teaching and physical activity. They can go hand in hand. Good teaching can be physical activity promotion and vice versa. Don't listen to troubles and problems with public health. We know that public health they're interested in trying to make a difference in physical activity, but they don't know teaching. It's our job to help them understand how to connect teaching to what they're trying to do. But we need to build an evidence base for teaching. If we don't have the evidence to support that teaching makes a difference in someone's physical activity, then yes, public health has resources that we will never have in education. They have a pull that can put physical education into simply physical activity minutes every day for kids, whether that means your program being there or not. And last, can the problem of an inactive culture be solved without the direct and intentional support of physical education? Something to think about in closing today. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate everybody being here.